Okay, so on to our speaker for this year. I think everyone should know Dennis Sheppard, our current president, and who's been president 3 times. What can I say about Dennis? He's been here since the very beginning. So if you want any dirt on Ajahn Brahm in his skinnier days, you could probably ask Dennis. He's also has been the vice president. He's a building designer, poet, Buddhist marriage celebrant, marriage counsellor, meditator, and hypnotist. And he does past life regressions, so I'm sure he's got very interesting stories. Dennis will be guiding the meditation tonight, and afterwards he'll be sharing some of the thoughts, reflection, and insights gleaned from his life of practice and research that he has written about in a book called The Universe Within Me, and it's the story of all stories. So I'll let Dennis start the guided meditation now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anusha. So the meditation tonight, what I'd like to do is to run it through really into the talk, because I'd like to offer you a meditation tonight that focuses a lot on stillness, just understanding just what stillness is, and more to the point, being conscious of stillness, what that means, being conscious of what stillness is. Because, as you will see when we get into the talk a little later on, that this still consciousness is a very important aspect of meditation, is really where most meditators we're heading for, where we should be heading for, really, if we want to really fully understand what the Buddha was pointing to. So the practice, in the first instance, what I'm going to be doing with the meditation is to make it fairly basic for the start. So we'll start just with a look at our bodies and sort of settling ourselves down, and then we'll move into a meditation on the breath. But after that, I'm going to be asking you to just let go of the breath and just to try and be with what stillness is. And I'll try and guide you into that so that you can try and keep that stillness going actually during the talk, so that it ends up being something that you can see while you are listening, or be with while you are listening. So just in the normal way, if you can just make yourself nice and comfortable and back nice and straight. And I always like to just look at this little curve in the back of my back here, just to make sure that that's nicely balanced. When that is nicely balanced, it allows the right energy to come into the body. You can sort of keep yourself fairly erect, and it just helps the mind to settle when the posture is right. So, as Ajahn Brahm is always saying, you just make sure that you're comfortable and that you're that there's not too many aches or pains and that in your body. If you need to move or shift anything, please do that now. But then, when you're ready, just close your eyes. Have the top of your head pointing to the ceiling. And just allow your tongue to rest against the palate of your mouth. Close your mouth and just breathe through your nose. And you can take some deep breaths for a start, just to establish your position, just to establish where you are at, right here and now. Learning to be with this present moment. So we're bringing our attention into our bodies, leaving all of what's outside on the outside, and just bringing the attention inside the body. You can just see yourself sitting. And then perhaps you might want to just run a little scan through your body, just starting at the tips of your toes, and you can just, if you're having trouble to see them, just give them a little wiggle, or feel them against your socks or against the floor. And just put your attention there, and then just let your attention run over the arch of your foot, into the heel, and then up through the ankles, just the articulation on your ankles. And moving up through the shins and the calves. Sometimes think that you can notice the hardness of your shins, especially against the softness of your calves, the big calf muscles at the back. And then moving up and just noticing the bend in your knee. If there's anything that needs adjusting there, just do it. Just let any tensions there, just let all the tensions relax. Then moving up through the thighs, those big muscles in your thighs. Just feeling their potential and their power. And then the attention can move through your bottom. Just feeling the weight on your seat. Then up through the tummy. Sometimes a lot going on in the tummy too, just little rumbles and gurglings, movement. And round your back, just round the base of the spine. Just bringing your attention up through the core of your body, up through to the chest and the back, around your shoulder blades. Then maybe just putting some attention onto your heart area. You might just be able to feel a few rhythms going on there, a bit of movement. And then the arms, just how they hang by your sides, just gently, just hanging down. Then bending at the elbows and through into the forearms and into the fingers and the hands. The fingers always seem to have a fair bit of energy into them. Just round the tips of your fingers you can usually feel a lot of energy there. Then back up to your neck. And just feeling your head, how it's nicely balanced on your shoulders, and then just as you're moving through your head, through into behind your face, just behind the eyes. Round your lips is again always an area where there's usually some tingling or lots of energy. And then round the top of the head too. Always a prime spot to find perhaps even some tingling. Now already you'll start to notice that your body is starting to relax. If you're lucky and you're putting your attention maybe around your lips, around your fingers, perhaps around the top of the head, you might even be able to notice some tingling going on there. And just like that effervescent fizz that seems to surround your body as it relaxes. The body just relaxing. And just noticing how that relaxation is there and quite noticeable already. The body's starting to settle. And when you do feel relaxed enough, just to allow yourself now to just go to your breath. I usually like to find a spot just on the tip of my nose where you can feel the breath coming in and out. If you need to, you can even just breathe a bit harder so you can feel the air. And the idea is just to stay as if on guard at the tip of your nose and just to know whether the breath is going in or out. This is a quality of just bare awareness, just to know without thinking about it, without making a commentary. Just to be aware of what the breath's doing, whether it's going in or out. You may vicariously notice that perhaps the breath coming in might be a little cooler than the breath going out. But just staying fully in touch with the breath, following it all the way through from the time that it begins and then to the time it finishes and ends. Just to start again. And as you are just noticing the breath, it's also a good idea just to try and be aware emotionally just how you're feeling, just to try and see how beautiful the breath is, or at least to appreciate that this breath coming in is bringing you life. So it can be very easy to bring up gratitude and just a good feeling. Sometimes it even helps if you want to just put a little smile on your lips. This beautiful breath. And of course the main thing is if you just stay on the breath, but if you do notice that you're not with the breath anymore, that you've moved off, just to allow yourself just to cut through wherever you've gone to. Just to cut through very gently but very carefully, very peacefully, very gently. And then just bring your attention back to the breath. So I'd invite you just to follow that process for the next few minutes. And just notice as you're doing it too, the way that your mind begins to focus and concentrate. So as the mind follows the breath, you can just take time every moment just to vicariously just look at yourself, just to notice the relaxation that's coming. If there is a tingling in your body, that's good. A good feeling. And just remember that you can always just use the breath to come back and bring concentration into the moment. Bring your concentration back into the present moment. If you find that you get lost. If you are sufficiently concentrated that you can watch 2 or 3 breaths at a time, or maybe 4 or 5, what I'd ask you to do then is just to take your attention off the breath and just to notice if there's anything else that's there. To take your attention in the moment. This might bring up a sense of confusion, or it might bring up some sort of a question, so what's he talking about? But if it's the clarity and the concentration is there, you might start to notice too that there's a sound of silence that's starting to make itself known to you. Stillness. And if you can find that, I would invite you just to be with that, just to get to know that stillness a little bit. Just to be with it. Because you can notice that this stillness is a continuous stream of consciousness. And when you're with it and when you're noticing it, you are most definitely in the present moment. And you can know that. And if you have found, or you can find, the stillness, you can also just notice that your breath is coming and going in that stillness. You can come back to your breath and you can notice that the breath is beginning in the stillness and it's ending in the stillness, only to begin again, to run through its cycle and then come to an end again. You might also notice that the sound of my voice is coming into the stillness. It's arising from the stillness of your mind. It has a beginning and an end. And what I'm asking you to do here is not really to take any notice of the sound of my voice or the meaning of what I'm trying to portray, but just to allow it to come and go in that stillness, in the silence of your mind. Just to notice that that stillness is there. And my words have a beginning but when the word finishes, it has an end. And just like your breath, it's beginning and ending in the stillness of your mind. You can notice that the stillness has a beauty about it. It has a peace. It's something that you can just easily rest with. And when the stillness is there, you can easily see what comes and goes in your mind. Because the stillness is like a datum for you. It gives you something to measure what's coming and going in your mind. But you can also notice that when the stillness is there by itself, there's a contentment. Which usually means that you've managed to subdue any desires or aversions that may be presenting for you. It's also allowing you to notice how your energy is, whether you're feeling energized or whether you're feeling dull. And just to notice where that happy medium is, just that happy middle point where the energy is nicely balanced. And then when you're using the stillness in this way, you're working with the hindrances. And I've just mentioned the first four: desire and aversion. And just when that balances out, to be content, to allow contentment to be there in the mind. And then with energy, the restlessness, and the sloth and torpor. When that is nicely balanced, is to bring you the right energy. And then as you work with all this, the fifth hindrance of doubt can also be worked with, so that you can know how you're feeling beyond any doubt. In a moment I'm going to end the meditation session with 3 rings on the bell. And over that period I would like you just to contemplate and stay with the stillness. And if it's all possible, I would like you just to bring that stillness back into the room with you. Not just to let your mind go again, but to keep the stillness there. And then on the 3rd ringing of the bell, you can just gently open your eyes and come back to the room. Come back to the stillness of this room. So I trust that that's, or maybe I could just ask for a show of hands. Does everybody see the stillness? How many people had a still mind during the... Yeah, there's probably some reluctance to show. That still mind's very important, and if you can bring that into the room now and sort of keep it there, that's just really just so much the better. Because I'm going to centre the talk tonight around really this stillness, this still consciousness that is there present all of the time for us. I guess from my point of view now, I'm 70 years old now, and I've been practicing this Dhamma now for, well over 40 years. Fairly strongly, I guess, too, over the years. So I guess you do start to pick up a wrinkle or two, and just to start to notice, especially when you're reading and working with the Buddha's words and trying to understand what the Buddha saw. And it's really quite joyful, actually, to notice, especially as I'm getting older now, and I notice in my own body the whole of the five senses are certainly nowhere near as strong as what they were when I was young. My coordination and my eyesight and my hearing, it's all much less prominent than what it was. But I think there's a natural occurrence too that happens too as you get older. That's a wonderful thing, and that is really that your mind naturally starts to get brighter. It's just something that happens. If you know that you're looking for that, I'm meaning especially. And it's a wonderful thing just to know where the stillness is. Because I think when we do start to understand things in this way, we can really start to see or start to understand what it was that the Buddha was pointing to. Just this verse, the first of the Eightfold Noble Path, just this right understanding, the right understanding of what he was pointing to. Because the Buddhist teachings is a subtle teaching. It's in many ways it's quite arcane in a way, when you look at the Four Noble Truths, when the Buddha says, the first Noble Truth is dukkha. I mean, you think, well, what a thing to even say. The first Noble Truth is dukkha, suffering. What does that mean? It's a sort of an arcane thing. It's not something that you would normally put out there if you're wanting to sort of gain a strong membership or following, from what you're saying, to sort of say something like that. And then the second and the third Noble Truths. But all the way through that meditation, what we were doing there is really looking at those Four Noble Truths. We were looking at certainly the second and the third Noble Truth. I was starting to introduce you there to the way things begin. Everything, all dukkha has a beginning. All conditions have a beginning. And then anything that comes into existence, anything that does begin, has an ending. And I think one of the most profound things that we can sort of think about with this is just really when we're looking at our mind and we've got that stillness there, you can see beyond any doubt that these conditions are coming and going in that stillness. And when we can start to understand that stillness in the bigger dimension of our lives, in our day-to-day living, and we can start to practice what the Buddha called mindfulness, to take that alongside our meditation, you can really start to get a good feel for what the Buddha meant when he talked about the second Noble Truth and the third Noble Truth, that conditions have a beginning, and that conditioning, anything that is conditioned and has a beginning, will have an end. And I'm going to sort of just talk a little bit more about that tonight as we go on. But also I just want to flag that towards the end of the talk too, I want to bring to your attention the practice of one of the Buddha's most devout disciples. His name was Ananda, and he was the Buddha's attendant for more than 20 years. But I'll tell you a little bit more about Ananda later on because I would like to just sort of make a point to you about this consciousness, this awareness of consciousness that we can easily start to notice in our practice. So, when the Buddha started his practice, when he first realised that he needed to do this, and I'm sure that we all know that story, the story of how he was a prince and had the life of royalty, really. I would imagine, a life of opulence, and he could really get anything that he wanted, and he moved out of the palace and ended up doing ascetic practices in the end. But eventually, just bypassing all of that, because I know that you all know all those stories, but eventually he got to the point where he found, what he saw was the middle way of practice. And this is really just such an important thing, I think, to notice, just in the way that I was just sort of pointing to the contentment before there in the meditation, and the way that energy gets balanced. Again, we're talking about a middle way there. But then that sort of brings up the point of what conditioning is, just what this dukkha is, this conditioned phenomena that happens to us all from the very first time that from the very time that we're born, really, or even before that, even in mum's womb. And of course, as Buddhists, we know that this goes back into past lives, which is a very important thing to realise and to know is quite true. Because I might just make a plea for that too, because the more the stillness, the more you can develop the stillness in your mind, you'll find the more that you can start to see and understand the truth of this, the truth of past lives, the truth of, I see that all, I'm not going to talk about that specifically today, but I see that specifically in my practice as a hypnotherapist, just working with people, especially when they have issues that relate back to past lives. So this conditioning that comes into us from a very early age, and right from the time that we're born. We're very dependent then, of course, aren't we? We haven't really got much control over ourselves, and we're very dependent on our parents. So we're being conditioned by our parents, first of all, mostly. And mum and dad are kings and queens in our lives. Everything that we take on board is really because of them. So we're conditioned in that way. But then as we start to get a bit older, then we maybe move along to kindergarten and start to get to school and get a few playmates and that. And then the conditioning comes from that area too. We start from school. And then as you get a bit older and you've got friends and so on, and they're having a big influence on you, the conditioning comes in from them, from your friends and of course there's your family that's doing it, and then you finally get to school, and the school is sort of moulding your mind and starting to condition you. And then from the school, of course, then after that the government has a shot at you too. They're always trying to make you be a certain way. There's always this sort of talk in our communities of educating the people. And all of that really means is just really conditioning us. So in every way, really, right through our lives, we're involved in this conditioning process. And really, what sort of struck me about that too is that really this conditioning process is a little bit like hypnosis. Because the conditioning mostly comes in when we're not aware, when our mind is very relaxed and the mind's very still, and consciousness is not there. See, because the conscious mind itself actually, in a way, is a protection of our body. It sort of keeps us safe. Like our conscious mind will, if we were just like babies, you would, and there's a fire, say there, you might just go up and put your hand in the fire. But when your conscious mind starts to take charge of your life for you, when you start to develop your ego and you start to develop your sense of who you are, that conscious mind will say, no, don't put your hand in that fire, that's going to burn you. So it has a kind of a protection, and it'll sort of, it starts to keep you kind of as you are. It starts to build your ego and keeps the conditioning inside. But when that conscious mind is removed, as we do in the hypnosis process, the mind's very vulnerable to take on suggestion. And this suggestion is always in the form of some conditioning or another. So even though we might think that we're in charge of our lives, in many ways you can see that we're not, because we are really creatures of conditioning. We have that process going on all of the time inside ourselves, and it's just normal, it's natural, you can't really ever stop that. But it's good to sort of start to understand just what that conditioning is, because the conditioning itself is, it always has a spectrum. You know, if you take anything that you think about, you know, you can maybe think about looking at the light. But once you kind of start to contemplate light, there's always the other end of the spectrum, which is dark. Or, you know, I might feel here and say this is nice and smooth. But I only really know that that's smooth because I know the other end of the story. I know what rough is, so I can sort of discriminate that this is smooth. And this dichotomy, this duality in conditions is really there in everything. It's very Jungian, you know, the shadow side. I mean, anyone that does psychology will certainly know all about that there's the shadow side to all of the feelings and the experiences that we have. But I mean, the most remarkable thing though too is that all this duality, this spectrum of conditions is the same in nature. And we can notice it in science, in physics too, that there's, well, now we know over this last 100 years or so that there's matter and there's antimatter. Any particle that you want to bring into existence, whether it's, say, an electron always has an opposite, which is a positron. Or if you're looking at neutrinos, there's the antineutrinos or antiprotons and protons. You know, there's anything at all that comes into existence has an opposite. And this is the same for all conditions. And when you start to sort of notice this, you start to see that these conditions are, you can start to see why the Buddha talked about it as dukkha. Because if, you know, it's just very natural, if you're wanting to just be happy all of the time, and you just grasp onto wanting to be happy, well, then you're going to be very disappointed when unhappiness or sadness comes along. Because it naturally will. You know, anything that you want to contemplate will always, the opposite will usually arise for you. Even though we do, of course, practice to bring in positive energies and try to reduce the negative energies, but as Ajahn Brahm's always telling us here every time that he talks, you know, just ways of sort of being. We need to find ways of being with the depressions that come up in our minds from time to time, as well as enjoying the happinesses. To look at the anxieties as well as the times of stability and joy that we have. So all of these things, you can see that our life is really built on this spectrum, and you can start to understand when you look at these dualities of that's there inherent in the conditions. You can start to see why this dukkha ended up being the first noble truth that the Buddha talked about. Of course, we've got the first noble truth, which is the dukkha, and then the second noble truth, which we've already talked about, which is conditions beginning. Third noble truth, which is conditions ending. And the fourth noble truth is really the pathway to see and understand what all this means. The eightfold noble path. And of course, that's made up of three elements, really. There's a moral dimension to that. There's a meditation dimension to that, which we've just been practicing. And then, of course, there's the wisdom element to it too. But those three aspects of the Eightfold Path, when they come together well, then we can start to set ourselves up, set our mind up in a way that we can start to see what it was that the Buddha actually saw. So, the best way to notice these conditions, though, is to develop the stillness. Because out of all of this, what we really also need to be with and understand is just that this present moment is just so important to be with. Because, you know, after all, the present moment is really the only reality, isn't it? We really all know that. I probably don't really need to say too much about that or say much more about it, but the fact is that we are always, whenever we're kind of unhappy or we're sad, it's always because we usually get caught up in things that has happened in the past, or we're worried about or anxious about things that might be going to come up into the future. So this depression maybe that comes from the past and the anxieties that maybe might present themselves into the future. So when we get caught up in those past and future events like that, that's what usually causes us grief and causes us to really notice what this dukkha is. But understanding and being with the present moment is a great way to balance all of that. This is really the pathway to contentment. That really is where we find this contentment in the mind. When you can be present, when you know how to be present, you're automatically developing in yourself a measure of contentment in your mind. And of course that contentment, it goes without saying that it's very important to have that, because when the contentment is there, you can start to see a little bit deeper and a little bit more deeper into the nature of this present moment. But the present moment is usually predicated on this stillness, this consciousness we have, this consciousness of stillness that we can all develop and see right here in the present moment. And as I said in the meditation, when we can be with that stillness, when we know what that stillness is, we can learn. We can then notice the things that come and go, because we start to use the stillness as a datum. When you're measuring anything at all, whether if you've got a set of scales that you weigh yourself on, if you haven't sort of centred the scales back to zero, and you jump on them and they're not they haven't been calibrated, well then you're not going to get a very accurate reading. And that's the same as if we don't know, we haven't got any datum to measure our lives with, or to see what's happening in our lives, then it's very difficult to know what you're doing. You're kind of just going with it. You're going with future stuff, future anxieties, and then bouncing back into past depressions, and moving like this without really fully understanding just where peace of mind actually is. So the stillness is a terrific way of calibrating your mind. When you can see that stillness there, you can start to notice things coming and going in it. And what's amazing about this, what really truly amazes me when you read what the Buddha said and talked about, with these things, you notice that all these conditions that come and go, they are on us. They're on scales that run from actually very, very small right to very, very large, very huge scales of things. So the Buddha had this ability to see in his mind, to see in the stillness of his mind. And I might even be good just to take a little sidetrack there, just to really point out that the stillness of his mind too, when you've got the stillness there and you're just looking at the present moment, you're really looking basically at what infinity is. You're looking at, you've got infinity right there. I notice this with when I'm doing past lives, because the Buddha's past lives, they just sort of fell out of him like a story. That was just, one after the other, just one life after the other. His mind was particularly brilliant. But I noticed that I've been sort of working with techniques a little bit with some of my clients, and just using the stillness with clients to bring past lives out is quite wonderful. When there's a still mind there, and you're not sort of thinking, you're not kind of caught up in the past and the future. You've just got the stillness there, and you put a direct question into your mind. What was my past life? What happened there? It tends to just roll out. It'll just, the thought comes there because your mind is more or less, it's moving to that 0 point, moving to the infinity of the universe. And just sort of continuing this little aside that I'm making here, even if you look at, I always liked the story of Albert Einstein when he first sort of realised what relativity theory meant. He actually imagined himself riding on a photon of light, travelling at the speed of light, and he was riding on this photon, and he realised that he could cross the universe in no time. Just let that sink in. He imagined that he could cross the universe in no time. So that's basically, what we've got here when the stillness is really working for us. We've got really the potential of the whole universe. It just sort of sits there. So you can start to develop wisdom from understanding this and sort of seeing this deeply in your mind. But anyway, just coming back to the point of having the stillness as a calibration point, because you can start to see your life moving against this stillness. And when I'm talking about these scales of existence, there was a monk or a series of monks, or a group of monks. A group of monks approached him once and said to him, when did all this begin? When did consciousness begin? And the Buddha said, I've been back in my mind over 24 kalpas. And he said, no beginning can be seen. This is very interesting, because a kalpa, in actual fact, is what the Buddha was referring to there, is a universal cycle. So in this current universal cycle that we're in now, we're supposedly about 14 billion years from what's supposed to be the start of the universe, which was they call it the Big Bang. But we're about 14,000 million years in, and, goodness knows how long it's got to run, but, physicists talk about proton decay in maybe, 80 billion years or something like that. So we're not very far into this universe, but the Buddha was able to say that he'd been back over 24 of these, 24 kalpas, 24 universal cycles, and no beginning can be seen. But even that just gives us the hint that even universes begin and they end, because he saw this in the stillness of his mind, in the still consciousness of his mind. He was able to see how even universes, the beginning of a universe and the end of a universe, how all that works. But then, of course, as we're sitting here in this room and we can watch just a breath, we can see a breath beginning, we can see a breath ending. But we can easily notice a day beginning, and then a day ending. And then we can notice too, maybe a year. The year finishes, or the time that it takes for the Earth to revolve around the sun in a year. We can see that has a beginning and it has an ending. So all of this is beginning and ending in the stillness of our mind. So we can start to really see, we can start to understand that and use our insight and wisdom to know that all of this is happening inside our mind. It's in the stillness of our mind. All these scales of things are happening. And then when you get down to the other end of the spectrum, where you're looking at the way consciousness works, because the stillness of our mind that we're looking at, if you look at it, my insight into that is you can see it as like what I'd call an iteration. This stillness is going around and around. It's beginning and ending. The stillness is the conscious moment is beginning and ending. It's coming around and around, and you can sort of almost sense that in the way that it presents itself to you, because it's a very palpable thing for you to watch and to notice just how that stillness works, going round and round. But in fact, the Buddha said that consciousness itself, it comes and goes countless times in the wink of an eye. So this is the beginning and end of a conscious moment, countless times in the wink of an eye. So the Buddha had one of those minds, obviously, that he could see right into deep time, right into deep space and time. It's very, very, very difficult to even get your head around all of that. But then also he could look back the other way and see just what the scale of time in what we call these days, we call it the quantum level, the quantum mechanical level. He could see how consciousness comes and goes in the wink of an eye. So these scales of beginnings and ends are really something to behold, something to really to look at and contemplate. And you notice as you're looking at all of that, you start to really get this idea that this universe is a mental construct. It's not so much it's not so much what's out there, because you're starting to get the idea that you're starting to see that this, even though we project this universe out there, but you start to get the feeling or to understand the way that this universe is really a mind-made thing. And of course, this is another thing that the Buddha talked about too in the very first verse in the Dhammapada, is that mind is chief. The Buddha said, mind is chief. Mind is the forerunner of all things. So you start to get the idea of what this universe is, and you can see that it's all contained in this present moment, just as Einstein saw. The whole universe, it's mind-blowing, isn't it, to think about it? It's all contained in this present moment. Not just this universe, but all other universes, all of our lives. So, of course, now what I'm starting to point to here is that, we've talked about the beginning of the breath, the beginning of a day, ending of a day, beginning of a year, ending of a year. But we're also talking about the beginning of a life and the ending of a life. And I'd like to just read you a little verse from the Dhammapada here, just for you to contemplate, because I love this verse. I've always loved it. It was actually brought to my attention by a monk called Ajahn Sumedho. Some members here will remember Ajahn Sumedho, who's a wonderful, wonderful teacher. He's getting very old now. I just saw him on the YouTube the other day, though. He was just giving a talk in Singapore, so he hasn't lost any of his style at all. But anyway, he used to always recite this verse. And the verse goes, it's verse 21 of the Dhammapada, and it goes, "Heedlessness is the deathless path. Heedless let me start again. Heedfulness is the deathless path. Heedfulness is the deathless path. Heedlessness is the path to death. Those who are heedful do not die. Heedless are like the dead. So I'll just repeat that again. So heedfulness is the deathless path. Heedfulness is the path to death. Those who are heedful do not die, but heedless are like the dead. So they're the Buddha's words. So what does he mean by that? What's he talking about here? Heedfulness is the path to the deathless. So this is really where I'm pointing to again here with this consciousness, this idea of being aware of our consciousness, being conscious of the stillness. Because the stillness that's at a quantum level is going around and around countless times in the wink of an eye. That's this stillness that's there all of the time. But what I'd like to just introduce here too is a teaching that came from Ajahn Chah, which is Ajahn Brahm's teacher, Ajahn Chah in Thailand. He used to exhort his monks to know the apparent and to know the transcendent. This is how he used to speak. He'd say at the beginning of a retreat, he'd say, don't you monks at all worry about what your teachers and that are doing. You know, you just sort of concentrate on your meditation and develop the meditation, develop the stillness, basically. He said, but beyond that, you know, we need to know when you're looking at what's apparent, at the same time to always know where the transcendent is. So what he was really meaning by that is just what I'm sort of pointing to here with the stillness. So I'm looking out here now at the audience. I can see you all here. And this is all apparently true. But behind all of that, I can see that this audience that's out here is also in the stillness of my mind. And from your point of view, looking back towards me, you will notice that I'm appearing in the stillness of your mind. So this is really what Ajahn Chah was meaning here, to know the apparent and to know the transcendent. What is transcendent and what is apparent? So as we start to work with that more and more, I can start to think a little bit more, or I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what I alluded to at the beginning, and that's the story of Ananda. I'll just make sure that I haven't missed anything that I wanted to just talk to you about there. I think I'm basically on track. Because Ananda, he was an astonishing monk, actually. He was an attendant for the Buddha for about 20 years or so, but then he also he used to, in times when the Buddha was resting or sleeping, he used to attend to the sick as well. And I might say that Ananda too was also the monk who encouraged the Buddha and really probably ended up in a way talking the Buddha into making sure that there was an order of nuns set up. The Buddha was a little bit reluctant to do that right at the start of his first exhortation to do that, but Ananda kept on at him with it. Because I think the Buddha, at that, when you think about life back 2,500 years ago, it probably, the equality of men and women probably even though there was certainly, I'm imagining that there was sort of respect for each other there, but it would be very different than today's circumstances. But anyway, this is Ananda. He is a man that I imagine must have had just the most beautiful mind, a beautiful person. But he was never ever enlightened while the Buddha was alive. Many other monks and nuns too, for that matter, were enlightened, but Ananda never quite realised or understood totally what the Buddha was talking about, because and even at the Buddha's death, when the Buddha was dying, Ananda was brought to tears. He started to cry. And the Buddha admonished him. He admonished him quite gently, I imagine, but he told him, Ananda, you must, start to realise what was happening. And so the Buddha died, and then it was shortly after the Buddha died that there was going to be a big meeting there was 1,000 arahants were going to meet together. And Ananda really did want to be part of that gathering. So he really set about practicing quite diligently and much more harder than what he'd previously done. And it's quite a apocryphal story in Buddhism, really, because he was practicing that hard that he probably almost got a headache from it, and he realised that he needed to rest. And this time he was going to lie down on his bed. And it says that before his head hit the pillow and as his legs were in mid-air, he became enlightened. It just happened like that. So what happened to Ananda there? What happened? What made Ananda enlightened? Just in that, like a switch, just went off in his mind that made him enlightened. I mean, obviously Ananda had all the work. He'd prepared himself well. His mind was ready for the enlightenment experience. But I think, from my perception of this, I sort of talk about this as like the switch, because the Buddha talks about this too. There's something in Buddhism called mundane experience, and there's supra-mundane experience. So mundane experience is just like, the apparent and the transcendent. To know the apparent and the transcendent is still what the Buddha called mundane practice. But the supramundane, though, the supramundane practice is when you know beyond any doubt that your mind has in fact unified. This unification process has happened to your mind, and you know beyond any doubt just what it is that you're looking at. And this is actually, I think, what happened with Ananda, because when he lied down, it was an interesting thing as he lied down, because the Buddha always talked about the 4 postures to practice in, walking, standing, sitting and lying down. But Ananda was one of those people that he actually became enlightened in none of those postures. He was sort of halfway between standing and lying down. But I think that what happened to Ananda, though, was that this sort of switch went off in his head, and he realised that the consciousness that he was obviously so very used of, the transcendent was there before he was lying down, but by the time he got to his bed, by the time he lied down, the transcendent had unified. In other words, consciousness had finished. So there was no consciousness coming back from the universe itself. The consciousness of Ananda's mind became unified inside his body. And he realised, he knew that when that happened to him, that if he in fact died at that particular point of time, that there would be no more rebirth, because rebirth can really only happen when there's consciousness that is iterating, carrying the karma of past lives back through. So this is a real story that's there in Buddhism that gives us a good idea of just what it is, what this experience is, and what the Buddha actually saw, what the Buddha was talking about. This fact, or this state that the Buddha called supramundane state, a state of knowing that consciousness had finished, and that there was no possibility of him then being reborn, that he was unified into the moment. And if I just come back and I read you again this verse, just with what I've said, I'd like you just to contemplate this again now, just based on what we've talked about here. So it just goes, heedfulness is the deathless path. Heedfulness is the deathless path. Heedlessness is the path to death. Those who are heedful do not die. The heedless are like the dead. So you can really see how that verse that the Buddha wrote sort of fits into that whole process. I mean, I do think though that Ananda was a particularly special person. He was certainly ready for enlightenment, because I think there's many people that can see that. And in the way the Buddha explained, there's 4 states of being too that the Buddha talked about, where you can have levels of this understanding, where you just need to maybe do a little bit more work with the Eightfold Path, perhaps the moral side, or it might be a little bit more on the meditation side, just so that until it all fits together, so that the unification process can happen, so that everything comes together. And you can see from what I'm talking about there too, just the beauty of this universe, just the perfection of this universe that we're living in now anyway. I mean, we are all really living in a state of perfection. But the dukkha that we all carry, that's really what spoils it for us, isn't it? But what the Buddha's talking about here is really is this unification of our mind. And when that unification process is there, then it's then you're starting to work towards, you're starting to understand and see what the Buddha actually saw, just how this universe is one, how the universe works. So I might just leave my remarks there and call for any questions, if there's any questions that you have formed in your mind that you would like me to have a shot at.
Thank you, Dennis. As always, the silent stillness is so beautiful. Regarding unification, does that mean that duality then disappears? That all is one? That there is no duality?
Well, this is a good question. When the Buddha was asked questions like this, he is said to have maintained a noble silence. So, it's really, because I'm not enlightened, so I can't really just tell you exactly what that means. I mean, I'm very confident with what I've talked and told you about tonight, because that mundane state and the supramundane state are certainly something that we can all aspire to. And I think as lay people, we can. We should really aspire to it. In fact, I would love to, just as president of this society, I mean, I would really love our lay community to be much more confident in because you often hear, oh, gee, I'll never be enlightened, or I can't do this, it's just too hard, you have to be a monk or you have to do this. But the fact is that when the Buddha, I'm sort of getting a little bit off tangent here, but when the Buddha, before he died, he made sure he had set up the 4 pillars of what he called the 4 pillars of Buddhism. And those 4 pillars are the association of monks, the pillars, the association of nuns, and the association of lay men, and the association of lay women. Those 4, he called them the 4 pillars of Buddhism. And the way that he set it up. And I think, when I look at this society, I'm just really so enamoured with our society here, because I think we've got a very perfect sort of setup here that sort of that mirrors what the Buddha asked for there very, very lovely, in a very, very nice way. We've got the lay people kind of supporting the monks, and then the monks coming back to teach the lay people. And it's kind of a beautiful process that allows everyone in that circle to benefit and to develop the wisdom that's required for us to be enlightened. So from my point of view, I'd really love for the lay people to be much more confident in what they aspire to, because I think that in the Buddha's day there was many people that were enlightened. But these days you don't really hear too much about it. I mean, there's people are a bit too frightened really sometimes to even say. I suppose because you don't want to put your head up too high anyway, because you're likely to get it chopped or lopped off. But also though, it's just coming back really to the 4 hindrances, or the 5 hindrances rather. When you're speaking about these things, you can only really do it when you've got a level of confidence, and the doubts that are there. Doubts are sort of a huge thing for most people. Most people that are sort of operating normally anyway, maybe not if you're a little insane or something, but if you're operating fairly normally, you must know. There's no point in trying to fool yourself or fool others. In sort of claiming conditions that you haven't got. You need to be truthful with yourself, and you need to be truthful with others in the way that you present that. So
I'm just thinking, maybe unification for the layperson means non-judgment, and so if there is no judgment, then duality doesn't exist, because everything is okay. There is no right and wrong if you have no judgment.
Yeah, well, look, I would just respectfully have to just ask you to make your own judgment on that, really,
sure.
too, because and really, when it boils down to it all, we need to know this for ourselves. This is a very, very personal. The whole of Buddhist path is a very, very personal path. It's not. I've just been watching films lately. There's a film that's called Never Look Away. It's a German film. It's a long film, actually, 3 hours, and it's all subtitled as well. But it was looking at the dichotomy between socialism in Russia and the collective consciousness, and this artist that was working in that form, trying to find the truth, and he had to, in the end. He was faced with the dilemma all of the time, because he was anything that he was trying to do with his art to get to truth inside that collective system was always being contaminated by the collective, and the only way that he could really kind of get to the truth in the end in his art was by doing it by himself, and I think that's true for all of us. We really, in the end, will be the only ones that know whether we're being truthful with ourselves or not, or whether we've found truth or not. So, I think I respectfully have to leave that to you to decide that for yourself and to know for yourself.
as I can understand, whatever we perceive, whatever we see, from the universe to the atomic level, is something related to our senses. If we go to subatomic level, you mentioned about the neutrinos, and we go deep and deep and deep, we found energy. This energy, what do you think? Is it the truth of life, or is still our perception?
Yeah. Well, this is really where we're getting to the point of unification, though, too, because this is the same. You know, your question there is predicated more on physics or the physical sciences, and it's really exactly what the physicists are trying to do too. They're trying to unify the universe. So they're all the four states of energy there, and they are gradually doing it too. They've moved electromagnetism. They've combined that with the weak force, and they've combined the weak force and electromagnetism now with the strong force. That was that Higgs particle that they found not so long ago. So they're gradually working towards this unification process. But it's the same process, I think, needs to work in our minds. When you do meditation, you can actually start to see how these unifications start to work. Ajahn Brahma is really a particular, he's very good at teaching what he calls the jhanas. And a jhana is something, when you kind of realise it, it's something where your body just falls away. I mean, when as he'll explain it, when a jhana is known, there's nothing else there. The universe is gone. Your body is gone. There's just pure mind, pure energy. So really, and I might say too, there's a lot of people, I don't think, a lot of people have trouble finding or doing these jhanas, but it's not the only way you can do it either. There's Ajahn Sumedho, the monk that I've talked about before. He teaches a way where you can do this just by what I would sort of talk about is do it in an analogue way, where you're just sort of dialing your stillness down, so that the stillness in your mind, just dials down. Whereas Ajahn Brahm's way, actually, if I had more, probably haven't got enough time to sort of go into the whole thing with what he does now. But his way, he kind of uses it like a little catalyst, and it's just an instantaneous thing like this, where the mind just sort of turns, and at one moment the body and everything is there, and then the next minute it's not. It's just the stillness, and the matrix of the mind is just presenting itself to you. Probably best to go with Ajahn Brahm to sort of learn about that. But if you can't do it that way, there's the other way of just sort of the analogue way, I think, of just sort of turning yourself down. Ajahn Brahm's way is a particularly good way, though, because you know beyond any doubt what this stillness is, what this matrix of the mind is, what this energy is. But again, what I'm saying, that's not enlightenment. We're really just talking here about the transcendent. And this is what, and his teacher, Ajahn Chah, used to, talk about the transcendent and the apparent and the transcendent. So...
Thank you. When we talk about mind, of course, we don't talk about brain. No, definitely not. That's one thing I think that physics and science has to sort of come to terms with, really. That's the fact that the mind is not in the brain. The mind is much bigger than the brain itself. The brain maybe facilitates the mind, but it's certainly not the mind. And that's, just by the very nature of the talk that I've given tonight, you can see that mind stream of consciousness continues through all of the time. You can see that your life will begin in that mind stream, and it will end in that mind stream, and it'll be conditioned again to be reborn again in that mind stream, and under totally different conditions, of course. But
but nonetheless that mind stream is something that's still just flowing through. Just in the same way that the Buddha could see all of the beginnings and ends of conditions that had scales right from the quantum right up to the largest universal scales. He could see all that in his mind, and he was able to use that mind stream, or the stillness, as a datum for what he was watching.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, well, it's certainly after 9 now. I thank you very much for your patient listening and coming on to the talk tonight. I think, I don't know that we were told about who was coming next week, weren't we? Yeah. So, that's, of course, yes, yeah. That'll be a very interesting night. So I'll just invite you all to pay your respects in your own way to the Buddha, the Dhamma and the Sangha, and I'll bid you good evening.